I do first of all just register that we're going to talk about Jerusalem and its surrounding area as if we have no connection. And I just want to tell you, if you don't know, that a missile landed near the Church of Holy Sepulchre earlier in the week, and the Israeli government have closed down the church that we're going to think about, the Church of Holy Sepulchre, over Easter at least. And so that's part of the whole Iranian conflagration. So I think the danger is when we talk about these places in the Bible, we treat it as like Disney World. It exists in a bubble, some way off in history. So I'm partly saying, let's think about it in detail so we get beyond it's just fantasy worlds existed in form, time and place. But also I want to register that actually it's a place not without trouble even today. And I'll show you photographs that I've taken in places that you can't visit today. And that's the sadness for everyone, I think. But, yeah. I've been to Israel many times, and I've taken pilgrimages there. I know some people have been on pilgrimages to the Holy Land, and I also spent 6 weeks in Jerusalem as part of my sabbatical 13 years ago. So you see some of those photographs too. No, I'm on. I can hear myself being on. Dennis, can we have a bit more volume, please? Okay, good. So, as I said, it's very easy to read the Passion narrative as if it's a storybook, like Peter Pan and Far, Far Away Lands, or Disneyland that we might visit but we don't visit. And I want us to just get the sense of scale and space, or the where and the when. And maybe you know some of this, maybe you know all of it, I don't know. But we shall see. If you want to stop and ask a question, then please do. As I don't have a script, I just have slides, so we'll see how we get on. So I want us to take us back through time. On the front page of the spire is a picture of St. Francis, the one that's coming out next week. So you haven't seen it. But is that so? But when we go back through time, we have to go through some significant people, interpreters, if you might like, of the Passion and the Holy Week. And Francis was perhaps the first person to really take seriously in the modern world the setting of Jerusalem. So Francis wasn't simply a person who wandered around shoeless in northern Italy. He had a worldwide vision. And he sent his friars, his brothers out, and as I wrote, in 1217 he sent some to Jerusalem, which was then under Muslim control. And later, the Pope gave the Franciscan order custody of all the places that were being kept as holy places in Palestine, Israel. But, so that's why today, if you go to most of these churches, they're run by the Franciscans. But in the time that he visited, and he spent quite a while in Israel after he failed in his peacemaking attempt with the Sultan, which you can read about in the spire, he set out 14 pause and prayer places in the city where pilgrims could come and stop and pray for specific parts of the last hours of Jesus' life. And we'll come back to that. That's called the Via Dolorosa, the Way of Sorrows. And if you've been to Israel, you've probably been taken on that walk. So that was Francis, but he wasn't a historian. He was a spiritual, mystic kind of person. So he created places that weren't particularly rooted in the history. They were devotional, prayer things. We go back before him to Egeria, who in the late 4th century, so that's the 380, something like that, she spent quite a while in Israel, and she wrote an account of how Christians were keeping Holy Week in Jerusalem. So there was a discussion there about places and a discussion about the religious practices. So some of the things that we do in church on Palm Sunday and through to Good Friday and Easter Sunday, some of those you can trace back to Egeria's writings. But again, she wrote what she saw, and it wasn't archaeology or history. And then the big woman, I suppose I say, is Helena, who was the queen, she was the queen. She was the mother of Constantine, the emperor, and she visited Palestine in 326, 328. And in particular, in collaboration with the local Christians who were worshipping in these sites, she identified 3 key sites where they built significant churches. The church of the Holy Sepulchre, or the site of Golgotha, the Calvary where the cross was, the place where Jesus was born, and the place where Jesus ascended. And the church in Bethlehem, and to some extent the church in Jerusalem, you see what she set up. And there's also the discussion about whether she discovered the true cross at that time. And that's slightly more mythological, legendary, but that's where we go back in terms of current, modern, well, not post-biblical history is what I mean. So what I want to go back further is to the Gospels themselves and some archaeology. But let's do a bit of geography first of all. So we talked about Bethany today. Does anyone know? It tells you how far Bethany was from Jerusalem. That's what John tells us. It was 2 miles. So that's the red circle down in this side. There's a road that goes through to the east of Jerusalem. Jerusalem is that blocky thing there. And if you can see, there's a sectioned off corner sort of at 3 o'clock. That's the temple precinct. So Jerusalem is so big, and about a quarter of it is the temple. That's how big the temple was compared to a comparatively small city.
Where is the building of the wall of where they prayed and where they can't go?
Well, we'll get to that. I'll show you a picture of that. That's fine. So the thing about Bethany, as we read today, it's the home of Lazarus, Mary, and Martha. As I said this morning, no one can prove this. It's likely that Lazarus had one house and the sisters lived together in another house. If we read on in the story of Holy Week, we hear that Mary and Martha entertained Jesus. This is when she anoints his head. And Lazarus is there as if he was a guest. There we go. So anyway, Bethany seems to be the base where Jesus starts Holy Week. According to John, he goes there and stays there. It's slightly different in Mark's and the other accounts, but we think of Bethany as the place where it all starts. 2 miles outside from Jerusalem. Bethany now is called the place of Lazarus in Arabic. Don't ask me to say it, but that's what it means. It's not called Bethany by the people who live there. It's a horrendous place, I have to say. The church of Mary and Martha and Lazarus is the one on the left. It's enclosed, so you can't get a picture from a distance, so that's the best picture I've got of it. Franciscan church. But on the left-hand side, you can see something of the modern town. There was one occasion I went there. We visited a boys' home in Bethany, and we came out to go to Jerusalem in the rush hour. And you can see the width of the road. It's a kind of 3 either side, beyond dual carriageway. And it was gridlock, and there were people going up and down without any cognizance of which way the traffic was supposed to be flowing. There were people going, it was just horrendous. And it's a very poor, built-up Arabic city, quite unlike the little village of Jesus' time. Now, we're going to start with Palm Sunday. So Palm Sunday, Jesus presumably starts at Bethany, and he goes to this place that I call Bethphage. Bethphage is not a place that we know exactly where it is. It hasn't had that chain of history, but clearly, in terms of where it's mentioned on the story, it was on the far side of the Mount of Olives compared to where Jerusalem is. So if you can see, I've written Mount of Olives. I'm going to show you a picture of that in a moment. But Bethphage is on one side. And that's where Jesus picks up, if you like, the donkey. As I said, there's no archaeology there. The Crusaders found this stone on the left-hand side, which is behind the grill. But if you know how big donkeys are, you don't need a stone to step onto a donkey. It's not a horse. Anyway, so that's traditionally where, when people keep the Palm Sunday procession, whether on Palm Sunday next week or when you go on a pilgrimage, you start at Bethphage. And this is the Mount of Olives. Now, I think if you ask a child to draw a mountain, they draw it like this. The Mount of Olives is really an elevated plateau. Don't know if you can see that. This is really 2/3 to half of the Mount of Olives, and it goes off that way as well. This here is the temple in Jerusalem, and this is the valley we're going to talk about in a moment. But basically, it's a ridge, the Mount of Olives, where there were lots of olive trees. So it's a high plateau, as I said, and then there's a valley down here, and then it goes up this side. So it's like a valley like that. So that makes sense to you. Okay, so on the map, it looks like this. So this is Palm Sunday. Jesus picks up the donkey, and he goes down the other side, past what we will later know to be Gethsemane. Here's a picture of the up and the down, and you can see the people here. I'm on the top of the mountain here, and people are coming down here, down, 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 down. The valley has a main road past through some of it, and then it goes up the other side. So this is the Palm Sunday procession, goes down there, down into the valley, and up on the other side. And the key thing is you can see both ways. You know, it's a very small place. That church with the dome there is this church, because on the way down, in the Gospels, we read that Jesus wept over the city. He could see the city in front of him as he rides on the donkey, and he weeps knowing the fate of the city. So that's supposedly in a teardrop shape, and it has at the top of these are jars that collect tears, they say. I don't know about that really. And there's a window here. It's quite a famous window. It looks directly onto the Church of the Holy Sepulchre there. Okay. So that's coming down on Palm Sunday. And then Jesus would have gone into the temple this way. Now, Moya asked about where the temple stones are. What you see effectively now is not what was there in Jesus' time. We can work out where things were in Jesus' time, but then you can't read exactly one to the other. But Jesus would have gone into this gate called the Golden Gate, which now in the Turkish wall here is this gate here. And it's closed up. And there's one of these things I hear, but I'm not sure how true it is. But it's closed up because both the Jews and so the Jews expect Messiah to come in. Muslims to keep that blocked up. So that's the Golden Gate there. So Jesus would have gone through the Golden Gate, and according to Matthew's Gospel, I think it is, he cleansed the temple there and then. I think Mark has it the next day. But the temple, as I said, was a large area. And so here is one side of the temple. It's too far away here. This is the foundation stone here. This is the foundation for the building that is up here and up here, up here. And this wall here runs through this wall here and is what we call the Western Wall, or what used to be called the Wailing Wall, where the Jews pray, because that's the only stones left from the temple of the first century. But it's massive foundation. You're not seeing the temple. The temple was above that. And on the left-hand side here, this is why I'm showing you this, are shops. And there's a clearer picture here. This is where people exchanged their money into temple money, and they could buy doves and lambs and all the things they needed to buy. And that's outside the temple. So when Jesus goes into the temple and sees the money changers and the people buying and selling the animals, they did not need to be there. There was a dedicated place outside, but they kind of spilled into, rather than spilled over, they spilled into the area which was reserved for people to pray. So there's that. This would be the more conventional way of going into the first century temple. And here's steps. So almost certainly Jesus walked up, because that's the way everybody walked into the temple, that way. Okay, now, a little bit of chronology. It's easy to find discrepancies between the four Gospels. And we're going to talk about some of those if we have time. And you can't read the small print here. But these are the key events arranged in order. And if you ask me for a handout, I can give you a handout later. But actually, the four Gospels agree on all these things. So Matthew has quite a full account that's on this side, and John on this side. But you can see they marry up. So really I'm saying that the key events are all lined up. There's a bit of a muddle around the crowing of the cock and all that kind of thing that people talk about and scratch their heads over. But the general outline events of the Holy Week are fairly straightforward. There is a particular issue about how we see the Last Supper that I'm going to come to. And there's a question about what happened on Wednesday, which I'm going to come to. But my key thing about this picture is the order of events is broadly similar across the four Gospels. So let's move to the Last Supper. Now, we believe that Jesus kept the Last Supper somewhere in Jerusalem. That's fairly straightforward. Where is not so clear, but people say things like this. The sign of where to conduct the Last Supper is for the disciples to find a man carrying a jar of water. You remember that's part of the story. Now, there's a small area which was kept by the Essenes, which is one of the four sects of Judaism. And that was all about washing. And they were celibate. So it may well be that the person that the disciples spotted carrying the jar of water was one of the Essenes, or lived in the Essene quarter, and was carrying water as they would have done. And that was in this upper city, down in this bottom corner. There's also talk in the Acts of the Apostles about Mary's house, Mary who was the mother of John Mark. And that's where the church meet. So maybe they were having the Last Supper in that house. But tradition places it in this area. There is a place you can go to that is wildly out of chronology. It's much, much later, but is kept as the Last Supper house, or a place also where the Holy Spirit came upon the disciples at Pentecost. But no one really thinks that you can be absolutely certain. But it's in that area, by and large, people agree. So they have the Last Supper, and then Jesus we read, Jesus took the disciples off to Gethsemane. So they were in this lower part here, and they would have gone out through the city gate, and we read that they go through the valley, and I showed you the valley before, and I'll show you again. They go through what's called the Hinnom Valley, and then up to the Kidron Valley, and into Gethsemane over here. Gethsemane means place of oil press, so it's quite reasonable that it's near the Mount of Olives. And there is a garden still kept there, and the guides like to say some of these trees may be 2,000 years or longer. And it's true that olive trees last for a very long time. But this is a garden kept to evoke the Garden of Gethsemane, where Jesus took his disciples to pray and to wait. There's a church there, of course. It's actually called the Church of All Nations, because when they wanted to build it, all the different countries were invited to contribute to funding it. So that's the one on the left-hand side. You can't really see, but it's very dark in there. They deliberately make it a nighttime experience, because the whole point of Gethsemane was Jesus was there at nighttime. So if you're going to have a church, you make it feel as though it's dark, which is fair enough. So there, people think about Jesus praying, and then Jesus is arrested in the Garden of Gethsemane. And then he would be taken back, which way? This way, down the valley, back almost the way he came. And this is a picture of the valley. They've created a footpath now, so you can walk along the valley. You've got the busy roads either side, but there is a kind of nature reserve through the middle. It's called the Valley of Kidron, is the Valley of Darkness because it was so steep. But you may remember this was a full moon, so it wasn't quite so bad. So there they are. They're going back, and they go to the priest's house. There's 2 high priests involved, but I'm not going to talk about that. But they go to, and they would have been in this richer upper city area. So it's almost certain they go to this general area. And there are some steps inside the city wall, but there are some steps up to this area. So it's plausible that Jesus went up these first century steps, arrested on his way to the high priest's house. There is a church you can visit called St. Peter in Gallicantu, which they say is the high priest's house. Can't be absolutely certain, but it was a well-to-do house. It's possible that it is the place. On the left-hand side, there's a statue with Peter denying Jesus and the cock on the column above. And then the interesting thing under the house, behind the house and then under the house, there's kind of a stables. And then there's a big water cistern. That's this space here where they would have collected water, perhaps. Or it's also said by people who do these things, perhaps Jesus was kept here in a cell, so to speak, in this water cistern. And so we take people down there and we read a psalm about being abandoned and where's God and all this kind of stuff, which is quite a moving experience for folk. So that's kind of block 1 before all the high priests. And then Jesus was taken to the Roman governors. Let me show you a picture. I don't know if you can see this. Let's hope. So on the left-hand side, we've got Palm Sunday. Then Mark is the next. Mark tells us Monday, Jesus goes into the temple. He curses the fig tree on the way in that hasn't borne fruit. He teaches in the temple. Then on Tuesday, he goes back to the temple and he sees the fig tree is withered on his way in. And then there's a long speech about wars and rumors of wars and how the temple will be destroyed and all that kind of stuff. And then the anointing at Bethany. So he's back at Bethany at that stage on the Tuesday. There's nothing detailed that happens on a Wednesday. So this is called the Lost Wednesday. I'll come back to that. Thursday, the upper room prepared, and then Jesus holds his Passover meal here. Gethsemane, arrest, high priests, Jewish trial, and then he goes to the Romans here, and then he's flogged, and the crucifixion on the Friday. Okay, so the question is, what happens? Let's put that one up. John's Gospel tells us that Jesus is killed when the Passover lambs are being killed too. We know, well, I won't go through the ins and outs of it, but so there's clearly a symbolism about this, that he thinks that the Passover is happening, the lambs are... Jesus dies when the lambs are killed in the temple, and the Passover happens after that. But we are familiar with the idea from Matthew, Mark, and Luke that the Last Supper is a Passover. And this is a well-known thing. I'm not making this up. This is a well-known thing that Matthew, Mark, and Luke seem to have a different calendar to John's Gospel. The question is, which calendar and how does this work out? Let me say that again, because it is complicated. John tells us quite clearly a lot of time cues through the Gospel. He tells us to do with the priests can't come in to see the Romans because they're keeping themselves clean for the Passover they're going to celebrate. He tells us that the lambs are killed at the same time that Jesus is killed on the cross. So the Passover that they eat would be after the lambs are killed. So it's Friday night, the Passover, according to John. But we've got Jesus celebrating some kind of meal, and it can't be after he's been killed. So his Last Supper which we've thought of in some ways being a Passover meal, can't be the same time as how John describes the rest of the city keeping the Passover. This is a well-known thing, and there's a question, how do you do it? Sometimes people say, oh, well, John's just fudged the dates. Sometimes people say, well, Jesus is having a kind of Passover-like meal, but it was his own creation. But I think there's a growing group of people who say, well, actually, we know that people kept different calendars. There was a Roman calendar, there was a Jerusalem temple calendar, there was Galilee keeping their times at a different place. The Essenes who were in the Dead Sea, they kept their times at a different place. And it may well be that Jesus was adopting his own calendar, or adopting one of those calendars, so that he was able to say, we're keeping Passover on the right day when we celebrate the Passover, the day before everyone else does in the city. Just to make a point I said to Ros, in our reading this morning, there was discussion about the Jews. I think in that passage, it should say the Judeans. The Galileans and the Judeans were the same religious grouping, but they had quite different attitudes and customs, including keeping slightly different calendars. And so when John, who was a Jew, talks about the Jews in a bad way, he's more likely picking out a particular group of Judeans. It's the same word in Greek. So it's not a uniform keeping. So they're in the Roman governors, that's where we're up to. If you go to the, if you do the Via Dolorosa, you're taken to a particular place where there is on the floor, that's this side of the picture, a Roman game that it says the soldiers played, the Game of Kings. I think now scholarship says that is not the place. It's more likely that Pilate went to the best place he could go when he was visiting Jerusalem, which was Herod's palace. He would take over Herod's palace and kick out Herod, and he would enjoy that place there. So that means that it's somewhere in that corner there, Herod's palace. After Pilate condemns Jesus, then it's a short carry of the cross through to the area outside the city, which is where the crosses were. What's very confusing if you visit Jerusalem, you talk about Calvary or Golgotha, and it's clearly inside the city walls, but that's because the city walls have moved. In Jesus' time, they go outside the city walls to kill people, not surprisingly. So, as I say, that's the next stage of this, carrying across through the streets. So you can do the Via Dolorosa, you walk along the streets there. This picture here is trying to show you that this is the route that people had taken on this way, but I'm suggesting most people think it was actually that way. But that's because Francis wasn't terribly interested in where it actually happened. He was helping people see the steps along the way. So this is the Franciscan way along there. Along the way, there are different stops, and now there are churches on these stops, possessed by different people. And when I've done it, doing all them all, it takes too long, so you pick the ones you want to pick. But you do get, you do get a sense of going through a city, which is, of course, what Jesus does and what the Bible tells us, that people watched him and said things to him and he said things to them. This is the only evidence of a crucifixion in the first century. One heel bone, although I think they have found something recently. But so there's no, people didn't keep the bodies of people who had been crucified. They were the worst of the worst, criminals and revolutionaries. So they were just left to decompose. But this is one heel bone that's been found which has a nail going through it. So I'm going to do that. Okay. So now we're outside the city wall. But today, if you visit it, it's this church here, the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, which if you've been to, how many people have been to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre? Oh, God's brilliant. It's a terribly complicated, muddly place because it has been changed over the centuries as bits fell down or bits were knocked down and they rebuilt it, and it's a whole heap of stuff. And what they like to tell you is that the Christians can't agree on how to look after it, so they get to kind of what's called the status quo. And so in the middle, when they agreed the status quo, they were doing some decoration, and the ladder there is left from the time 100 years ago when they said, well, that's it, no one's going to do any changes since then. I think the ladder's been replaced in that time, but there we go. Anyway, so this is a very old church, one of the oldest churches in the world, it would say. That was a Sunday morning before people were up. Now, the complicated thing about this is the church claims to be both the site where Jesus was crucified and the site where he was buried and entombed. So I'm going to show you this picture, which helps and doesn't help, really. So there's an outline of the church, and what the artist has tried to do is down here is the alleged site of Christ's tomb, and over here, on this little bit of rock here, is Golgotha's rock. This was all a quarry. We know it was a quarry, so we know it was rocky, and there was a rock here that we believe that the crosses were put on, and then nearby, it looks quite close here, it's a little further away than that, there was more rock that was said to be the tomb, and it's all been enclosed under one church. So if you go in the door that I just showed you, you immediately turn right and go up some stairs, and you end up in a kind of gallery, which at the center of it is this chapel, I suppose, and in the hole in the middle you can touch the rock, the bedrock, or the rock of which the cross is supposed to be sited. So that's the place where we think Jesus was crucified, there or nearby. And then you come down the steps and you go off this way a bit, and you go to what's called the edicule, which is this kind of kiosk, some guides call it. And inside that, there's a piece of marble, and underneath the piece of marble, which you can only touch the piece of marble, underneath the piece of marble is more rock, which is said to be where Jesus' body was laid. Now, you have to say, with all these things, the more precise you get, the more error creeps in. I think it's clear that Jesus was crucified. I think, if 99.99% of people who look at this say, well, Jesus existed, we've got testimony he existed. It makes no sense for people to invent that he was crucified. He would have been crucified in this kind of place. We know there were crucifixions here. We know it's outside the city. We know the period of time. It was going to be in this kind of place. Whether it's there or there's not the issue. It's nearby. Then it talks about the garden tomb or the garden. That was nearby. We know, because I'm going to show you a picture now, that people were buried in that general area. These two little grave spaces are behind that kiosk I've just shown you. So we know people were buried there. So it's not unreasonable to say that Jesus was buried there too. That's all we need to say. But we know people were buried out in the open. Here it looks like very much you're in a cave. But the whole area around Jerusalem is riddled with graves in sort of cave-like areas. This is a distance away, but it's in Jerusalem. It's part of Herod's family tomb. But you can see there is a cave and a stone that goes across the front. That's the first century tomb. So that's, as likely as not, the sort of tomb that